Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on delivering commercial value and social value through procurement. We've got an hour. This session has been brought to us by Peopletoo and Human Engine. My name is Chris Hossack, and I'm going to be chairing this session for the next hour. It's going to be really quite packed. We've got loads of great questions, and we've got a great panel that I'll turn to in a second. So we're going to try and do this at pace. And as we go through the session, I'm hoping that we can take as many questions as possible from the people who are on the call. And my thanks to you in particular for turning out this morning for this session. I wanted to ask you to do is, as we go through, put your questions in the chat, and they'll get picked up on. We'll do the questions as we go. We've got three distinct sections that we'll go through it over the next hour. I'm hoping we can answer as many questions as possible. I can't promise to answer all of them because we are going to be moving at pace, which is a favoured phrase in local government at the moment. So that's that. As I say, my name's Chris Hossack. I'm actually the leader of Brentwood Borough Council. I've been a councillor for just over 18 years, and I've done that while trying my hardest to balance that with a private sector job as well. So that's a little bit about me. If I turn to the panel, as I say, we've got a great panel with us. Genine, can I come to you first for an introduction?
Thanks, Chris. Morning all. I'm Genine Whitehorne, and I'm the newly appointed Commercial Director at the City of London Corporation. It's great to be here this morning.
Thank you, Genine. Hilary.
Hi, I'm Hilary Morris, and I'm the Commercial Director at Barking and Dagenham Council.
Thank you, Hilary. Jonathan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathan Noble. I'm the Managing Director of Human Engine, one of your hosts for today, and I'm delighted to be here. And my thanks to Chris and the rest of the panel, and to all of you also.
Thank you, Jonathan. And last, but we always say this, but by no means least, Rosie.
Many thanks, Chris. Morning, everybody. I'm Rosie Thomas, Service Manager with Peopletoo, a fellow host of this morning's session. Work across adults and children's services and previous background in local authority commissioning. Okay,
great. So that's got us all started. I don't think I've missed anything from an introduction point of view. As I say, questions in the chat as we go, and we'll try and pick up on them at the end of each section. So great place to start really is by actually defining what commercial and social value is when we look at procurement. So I'm going to put some questions to the panel as we go, and I want to start by saying, look, actually, what do we mean when we talk about commercial and social value? Hilary, can I put you on the spot to get us started with that one, please?
Absolutely, and I'll keep it short and sweet for the first one. So I think commercial value is a value that we place on the outcomes that we need to commission. So how do we get the maximum value out of what we actually need? And social value is about the collective benefits that we can secure from any particular activity that we're doing with third parties.
Great, thanks, Hilary. Rosie, question for you, that taking the commercial and the social value aspects, do you see a conflict between the two of those? And if there is, how do we resolve that?
Not necessarily sure that there's a conflict per se really on that, Chris. It's more, I would say maybe perhaps more of a tension, which is something that can often arise in terms of that commission procurement conversation. And it's very often that balance between that local authority responsibility and legal requirement to embed that social value within their contracting processes. But often sometimes, and go back to what Hilary's saying there in terms of commercial value, sometimes that social value can often incur a higher cost because it's something that, you know, our providers will need to be able to embed within their work. And also we're looking for that fair market value that then creates that sustainable approach. Because if we're looking for that, and I'm sure we'll come on to it later in the conversation, but if we're looking for that lesser cost in terms of the provision itself, that necessarily drives a bit of a false economy, and therefore is that true social value in terms of our ability to create long-term impact in communities? Not necessarily sure, but I'm sure others in the group will jump in on that. Genine, you're nodding there as well.
I mean, Genine, what you're with City of London Corp, what does social value mean to your organisation? How would you define it as an organisation?
Yeah. So I think I should probably kind of preface any answer that I give with that I'm in week 4. So I'm still kind of feeling out what it means for City of London. But when I kind of have worked with any council around social value, I've always tried to challenge them to think, yes, absolutely, about the kind of added value you could get out of specific contracts, but also to think in a broader sense around actually how can we use our spend power and our influence to actually challenge and shape markets, shape the nature of the market, so that actually we're thinking about achieving those kind of socioeconomic, environmental benefits in a far broader sense and not just about our specific contracts. Looking at the City of London, I think that's kind of one of the areas that we're focusing on. And as a council, we're slightly different from a lot of councils because we only have about 8,500 residents. So the normal areas of spend are not the ones that are significant here, but actually the focus here is very much around supplier diversity, climate action, and how as a leader in the city can we kind of encourage and lead other organisations to really start thinking about how they tackle those issues too.
Yeah, that's great. And it's interesting, you know, the City of London is unique, I suppose, as a local authority with that low resident uptake, but a high business content as well. So, and so therefore different social needs within that local authority area as well. Has anyone got any further comments on that at all?
Yes, I definitely do. I mean, I think I would probably say social value didn't mean as much to us in Barking and Dagenham as it does now. I think it used to historically be seen as a bit of a tick box and something largely, if I'm buying something, if it delivers against a corporate plan, then that actually means it's delivering social value. And actually, I think that conversation has changed quite dramatically over the last couple of years. Now I think it's you know, it is the bit that makes the bit more of a difference. It's the bit that gets you where you want to get. And actually for us, we see this as a really good opportunity to connect our suppliers with the community that we are all trying to serve. So we've got a social value advisory panel, which we've put together over the last 12 months. It's got community groups, frontline services, some of our representatives from local business groups and the VCS. And actually we bring our kind of like big suppliers in to pitch to that group to sort of get suggestions about whether or not what they're thinking about in terms of social value is actually going to meet the needs of the people in that area. And actually, where do we get the most impact from what suppliers can actually achieve, taking into account all what Rosie said earlier about, you know, making sure we get the balance right between not adding extra costs. So it's how do we bring all of that together holistically to get the most impact for the least amount of cost for the council as well as for the supplier? Yeah,
that's a great point. Jonathan, any further comments on what we've heard there? I tell you what, I'm particularly interested in, Hilary, and I've just suggested Jonathan would come in on that. We'll talk in a moment about your social value advisory panel. I don't know if others are doing that, but that seems like a great thing to be doing, and it'll lead into the next question I've got for you in a minute. But Jonathan, I'm coming to you yet on this. And any comments?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I agree with all of that, which is disappointing because then there's nothing contentious to say. But you know, the day is young. So social value, the conversation has moved on considerably, and I'm very encouraged by that, but I have frustrations too, which we might come on to. So I guess I was involved in some of the quite early work on this, pre-social value days, when we just called it sustainable procurement, and that terminology was a bit confusing for people because they thought it was just about the environmental bit. So there's been an evolution, and we've gone from a very small number of public sector authorities being interested in this seriously, and maybe a couple more treating it as an add-on or a tick box exercise, to social value being really embedded in the mainstream now. I mean, it is very much business as usual. That doesn't mean it's perfect. People are still finding their feet, but it is very much in the consciousness of people. And frankly, in the way that it wasn't in the consciousness of a lot of procurement professionals, even 10 years ago. The procurement profession has been quite traditional, sorry to say, colleagues, in its approach in the past. And it took a while to really ingrain the idea that there are wider economic, social, and environmental benefits to be derived from procurement activity. But the consciousness is there now. You can see that from the attendance on this webinar. So we've got 82 people on the session this morning. People are turning up for the conversation, but I still think there's an opportunity to refine what this means. And so I'm delighted that, as Hilary's mentioned, at Barking and Dagenham, and I know of other authorities as well, people are including businesses, local people, and suppliers in those conversations, and not assuming that the public sector has all of the answers alone just because that's where the legislation sits.
Yeah, that's great. And if you look, and that brings you on to the question, if you look at procurement as a process, okay, and Hilary's mentioned the social value advisory panel that Barking and Dagenham have formed. At what point in the process do you start thinking and embedding the social value objectives into what you're actually going to go on to procure. Has anyone got any comments on that? I mean, where do you maybe come back to you, Hilary? Where at what point does the SB advisory panel kick in the process?
So the advisory panel kicks in when we've actually got a confirmed supplier. So you tend to find certainly with larger suppliers, they'll make a series of commitments, but they'll be, I'll do 3 initiatives a year, or I'll do so many volunteer hours, or I'll do so many of this or so many of that. And actually the advisory panel is an opportunity for suppliers who've made those sort of generic commitments to come in and pitch to the local community about some of the things that they think they could supply, and for the local community and frontline services and the business community to actually give a view as to whether or not any of the suppliers' sort of ideas are the right ones. So very much thinking about, so for instance, if we were looking to provide a print provider, they might deliver some social value where they'll deliver us a certain amount of printing initiatives a year. So actually, where would the printing initiatives best be deployed in the borough to make sure that they are making the most impact and where their need is greater? So certainly in terms of the advisory panel that we've set up, it's after a contract has been awarded. But in terms of at what point should we be thinking about it, I think we should be thinking about it at the strategic commissioning stage. Actually, it's very much a case of when we're developing the overarching strategy about, what we need and what outcomes we need over the medium to long term. We need to be including our aspirations about, what are the wider collective benefits that we could secure as part of any contracted relationship with a third party. And I think to do that well, you need to not just be having a conversation with commissioners, but you need to be bringing in a broader range of people into that conversation. And so it starts right at the beginning. It's not something that you're ready to push a button on a tender and you're scrabbling around trying to find words to put into that. I don't think it's at that stage.
I think that's right. And, using that phrase, if any local authority or any procurers finding themselves scrabbling around, what they really need to be doing is looking at their procurement strategy. And I don't know how often buyers are rewriting these things, local authorities are rewriting these things, but actually thinking it through and thinking it through in the context of, as we talked about a moment ago, the needs of your local community. What is it that's particular to Barking and Dagenham that they'd like to address through procurement, as opposed to the City of London, as opposed to, local authorities out in West Wales or wherever it is. Everything's different, but the principle should be the same, is how can we maximise not value in general terms, of course, but particularly in social terms. And I think that's great. Has anyone else got any comments on that before I see if we've got any questions that come through from an audience? Jonathan, I'm conscious that we had a good number on, so we might be getting a number of questions coming in.
Yeah, I've seen a few come in, Chris, which are quite interesting. But let me just append what Hilary said really, really quickly. So I agree with that. The answer to the question, where does this happen in the procurement process, is before the procurement process, way before. There's this thing called strategy that people might have heard of. And so this is my first soapbox moment, which I'll be quite brief about. But this is where I think good intentions have potentially turned into bad practice. So the original wording of the Social Value Act, which is the bit of legislation that governs this, you don't need the legislation, but it is there now, which is helpful, is that the duty is for public contracting authorities to consider how what is to be procured might create environmental, economic and social improvements to the well-being of a relevant area. So that consideration needs to happen pre-procurement. There's subsequently been a procurement policy note from the Cabinet Office that then requires authorities to explicitly evaluate. Now, the intention of that is that it moves the sort of quite woolly wording of the legislation consider into something more specific. What I worry about is that people are just doing the evaluation bit and putting a 10 or 15% social value award criteria into their procurements, and are using that as an excuse not to have to think at the front end of the process about how do we design this in such a way as it's more accessible for SMEs, that voluntary sector and social enterprises have a better opportunity to go for this, that there's targeted recruitment and training and employment opportunities built into it. So it's that front end thinking that I think we need to look at reinforcing.
Okay. Thanks, Jonathan. I noticed you said you were going to sort of maybe be a bit controversial, but everyone was nodding enthusiastically what you were saying. So That's
Chris, could I just add to that, please? Sorry. So going back to kind of the point that was made earlier, saying social value is far more embedded in councils. I think Jonathan said that, and I absolutely agree. But I still feel like in a lot of councils that I do work with in the past, social value still is seen as the responsibility of the procurement team, which means actually they are using the influence that they have, which is building it in the part where we are doing the buying, but just reinforcing both Hilary and Jonathan's point. Actually, social value needs to be seen as a responsibility of the whole council and embedded in the strategy before actually, it's past the procurement team aren't leading on that, but they absolutely need to embed it in their part of the process.
Totally agree. We need to avoid those sort of silos, don't we? It's about the community services team feeding in what the priorities are, what they're coming in across, and feeding that into the procurement team.
And one of the things we've done in Barking and Dagenham is we've actually got a social value coordinator. So their role is not necessarily to come up with all the answers, but to actually work with commissioning teams, suppliers, procurement, and to connect everybody as part of that conversation. And actually, I think that's done a huge amount to embed kind of like a real culture of social value within the commissioning and procurement process. So it has it's definitely helped.
Thanks, Hilary. Look, we've got a couple of minutes just left on this first session, which was about just defining what we mean by social value. Michael, have we had any questions come in that maybe the panel could have a go at sort of tackling if they're willing to do that?
Yeah, we've had a fair few, so I'll just pick a couple in the interest of time. So firstly, we have one from Kate, who's asked, how have Barking and Dagenham and the City of London engaged across the organisation to get an understanding of social and commercial value? If, like Reading Borough Council, where I'm from, services are leading specifications, so we need to get their buy-in.
Okay, it's a good question. I guess aimed at Genine and Hilary there. So Genine, can I turn to you first on that one?
Yes, absolutely. My answer might be slightly theoretical, given I am 3 weeks in. But I think the first part is, I think in the city, what I've kind of observed since I've been here is that social value is recognised as being really important. And first of all, there is resource behind it. So, Hilary spoke about her social value coordinator. There is somebody in the council that's responsible for that. And there is also a team that supports, sustainability in procurement in particular. And so I think the first step has to be saying, actually, if it's important to you, that needs to be followed by the investment in the resource to help lead, challenge and develop the capability and the acumen to do it. And then it really does have to be, I think, part of becoming every part of the decision making of the council. If I had kind of answered the question earlier around kind of commercial and social value, I would have said actually the kind of basic kind of foundation and premise of both of those things to me is understanding the implications of the decisions we make, be that by a commercial implication or about social benefit or disbenefit. And I think that has to be embedded across that kind of decision making and that strategy, as we said earlier.
That's great. Thanks, Genine. Hilary, did you want to pick up a couple of comments on that as well?
No, I don't think I've got anything else to add after what Janine's commented.
Well. Look, we got probably just enough time, Michael, for another go at a question.
Okay, there's a couple. I'll try and merge one because there's a couple which focus on SMEs and are they disadvantaged in the delivery of social value versus some of those larger organisations. And there's a second point which has come up a couple of times around the environmental impact of social value and how that fits in.
Okay. Anyone want to have a go at that?
Can I make an observation? So I'm not a procurement professional, so I don't get necessarily involved in the actual detail of tenders. But from what I understand of the outcomes that or the enhanced outcomes that we've got since we've had the framework I've described in place, my observation is actually SMEs tend to deliver pro rata much greater social value benefits than some of the big suppliers. I think if you take a kind of like holistic look at what is the impact of some of the much more targeted interventions that SMEs deliver, I think they do have a greater impact. So I think the trick that we have to solve is to make sure that our procurement and commissioning and tender process itself doesn't disadvantage SMEs from being involved in the process. But in terms of delivering social value, I actually think they do more than punch above their weight.
Well, I think they do in the sense that SMEs, not to put a broad brush on it, particularly are probably more local. They're closer and more connected to their community, rather than some multinational that's, got an office in the city of London and they're delivering services in Darlington, So I think there's a real value there. And they punch above their weight because I think they've got a distinct advantage perhaps over some of these big corporates. Okay, look, let's move on to the second session. Thank you to those that put questions in, Michael. So my thanks to the audience for that. Let's move on to policy through procurement. And if we look at, we started to talk a little bit then, touched on things like around local priorities, but look at some of the big organizational objectives, some of the big things that are happening in the world, whether it's issues around living wage or climate change. How can we contemplate and consider and sort of incorporate that into our procurement process as well? Anyone want to have a go at tackling that?
I think it's something that we've already started to touch on as a group a little bit this morning. It's the sort of integration of that commissioning intelligence through and into the procurement process so that we can really enable and facilitate that understanding of some of those wider national policy concerns and issues that we're due to address through our procurement processes, but also the more local and often sometimes hyper-local issues and challenges and priorities that we want to be able to address through our procurement processes. And I mean, if we've got good intelligence sharing and an understanding of what those priorities and inequalities are, then I think, and it's something that, Jonathan, Hilary and Genine, we've all touched on this morning, through that improved integration and building in those considerations and intelligence right at the start of that procurement process, making the procurement and tendering process as accessible and easy for a wide range of suppliers and bidders to engage with as possible, then I think it's very easy for us to address some of those wider national and local social value concerns that we'd like to address through those processes.
That's great, Rosie. Thank you. Look, Hilary, let me ask you, in local government, we got so many pressures in society, global society as a whole, and local government, as we know, picks up and sits at the forefront of a lot of those and is seen in many ways as being a solution provider. So with all of these pressures from global warming to, people trafficking and all sorts of things, how do we prioritize? What do we address? Can we address all of them? Can we address some of them? Can we address none of them? So how do we go about that?
I think it's about bringing together all the points that we've mentioned and actually thinking and recognizing that, one size doesn't fit all. You need to actually think about your social value outcomes and your aspirations at the start of your strategic commissioning process and integrate that as part of what you do. So it's not, it can't be a one size fits all. You need to make sure that you're bringing in people across different services to make sure that you're, the quality of the conversation about what you're trying to achieve is driving you towards the outcomes that will enable that. And one of the things I know we're going to touch on later is we mustn't forget that, sad as it is, the old truism is still there, that what gets measured gets done. And actually there's a really important component about how do we actually deliver it. And part of the answer to how we deliver it is making sure that we are actually monitoring and keeping on top of making sure that the commitments that people have made have actually been delivered. Otherwise, you just go back to the tick box exercise that I think we've sort of largely tried to move away from.
I think that's right, and I think one of the key words in there is delivery. And I think when you're setting your case out with the potential good or service provider at the outset in the process, you're making an assessment as to whether they can deliver. And then, of course, you can tell them that in service, you will be monitoring their delivery of not only a high quality service, but actually are they, in this context, achieving the value outcomes and the social value outcomes we're looking at. How do we, and this is a curveball question for me, how do we read that? How do we know? Because once we've procured. Yes, there's sort of gateways thereafter that can protect us. But once you've gone through that process and appointed a supplier, and we said we're going to measure you, and you find out they're not delivering, how do we kind of filter that out, suss that out as part of the procurement process so we buy with confidence? And again, I've just thrown that in, but I don't know if somebody wants to have a go at that. Genine, you're nodding. Maybe I could put that your way.
So I know we're going to pick up kind of contract management in a bit more detail later. So just focusing on the procurement bit, I think there's something around I think Hilary mentioned it earlier, we have to really know when we talk about social value, what that actually means for the place that we're in, define that and help people understand what's important for our council. But we also need to be cognizant of and aware of actually the different market sectors that we're dealing with. And I think sometimes councils come with a huge long list of things that they're asking for, that actually if you look at the type of service or the type of kind of market they're dealing with, actually the ability to deliver that at nil cost is probably near on impossible. So we have to make sure we are asking, yes, for the things that we need to deliver, but for the type of organisation we're working with, that they actually have the ability to do it. Because I think in some instances, we kind of are setting ourselves up to fail. And then kind of following on from that, we do actually need to make that social value is an integral part of the contract management framework, and actually isn't seen as optional when times get hard. And I think that we're still slightly in that phase where it's the first thing to get dropped when we run into difficulties.
Yeah, I think it's about in the procurement process, and that phase is having our overpromising radar on and trying to suss that out, because as we said, some of these issues are big, and it's about when you're assessing the provider or a potential provider is actually just to be realistic about how capable you are of doing something. And I think that would certainly give me more confidence on a procurement panel than somebody who was making, big claims as to what they might be able to do. I think realism in all of this, despite the issues, is absolutely key to the decision making. Jonathan, Rosie, have you got any further comments on some of the points made?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with you on that point, Chris. From a supplier's perspective, I would say the overpromising starts with the over-asking. So I think that was Janine's point. So, I see this quite often, actually, and this comes down again to the thought that goes into these things, and that evaluating social criteria is not a substitute for thinking about social value. So if you are going to be building a £25 million new secondary school, by all means, you want that built to high environmentally sustainable standards. You want to create local employment opportunities. You want to get people who are long-term unemployed or perhaps care leavers opportunities for training and employment. Those types of things are unlikely to be suitable for a 30 grand bit of consultancy. And yet we see it all the time. For this small consultancy contract, 6 weeks in duration, tell us how many apprenticeships you're going to create. And it's like, well, how many unemployed people do you want at the end of the 6 weeks is the response to that. It's just not technically feasible. So Janine's described an approach which is more sensitive to the markets that local government operates in, and those markets are diverse, let us not forget. So we've got 3 public sector reps on this panel, and you all come from organisations that have different service profiles. I mean, City of London is genuinely unique in that. But if you look at the difference between Barking and Dagenham and Brentwood, different services procured. And you wouldn't set out to design a business that fills potholes in the roads and looks after vulnerable older people. It's, unified by the fact that you're there to improve the outcomes for a place, but it's not necessarily the most obvious business model. So being sensitive to that and thinking about the markets that are under particular pressure. So you can ask for a whole bunch of social value stuff from the care market, but unless you're extraordinarily lucky, your local care market's probably close to on its knees anyway. On the other hand, if you are funding major capital investment and regeneration schemes with huge national providers who are probably doing a lot of this stuff anyway, absolutely ask for those commitments to improve outcomes for the local area, but also listen to their advice about what they've done previously and what's had the greatest impact.
Yeah, I think that's great, John. It's a fair challenge, isn't it? It's about both sides being realistic on the ask, but also being realistic about what you can deliver. So I think that's a fair challenge. Rosie, have you got any comments on this before I go and see if we've got any questions on this section?
Yeah, just really to echo what Genine and Jonathan have just been talking about. And one of the key pieces of advice that I'll often share with people that I'm supporting and working with in terms of developing service specifications and contracts around their social value is, are they able to prioritise what those local issues are? Are they easy to prioritise? If yes, brilliant. Are they easily translatable into a service specification? If yes, brilliant. Because if you can get those social value priorities embedded in those service specifications right from the start, which are then shaped and co-produced by individuals and with the provider markets themselves, then ultimately you're going to end up with far better chance in terms of meeting those social value priorities. So really just to echo what Jonathan and Genine are saying in terms of making it easy, not over asking, and enabling providers through a range of means to be able to meet those outcomes for you, not restricting them in terms of what it is that you're going to ask them to do, but get them to come and engage with you around some of the opportunities and priorities that they're able to shape based on their skills, experience, and local connectivity as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rosie. Michael, let's bring the audience in. Have we got some questions that have come through on this particular section around policy?
Yeah, so there's one from Paul, which I think was from the last section, but is still quite interesting and relevant, which asks, how can social value and better pre-procurement practices support the development of our local supplier base, particularly SMEs, as part of the wider economic development perspective? And I think he's asked this in the context of the community wealth building agenda. I think that's a really interesting question.
I think it's a great question because, of course, one of the social challenges we've got is promoting growth and promoting, businesses the opportunity to grow and be sustainable, employ people, create skills. So we have to think about, whilst we're talking to SMEs about procurement, about helping them at the same time. Anyone got any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to go.
Genine, please. Yeah.
So in my mind, I think that we have to be kind of thinking about how we use our influence to support our local economies. I mean, we need to be doing that anyway, but kind of post-COVID and lockdown, it has to form a really important part of what local economic recovery looks like. So in my response to kind of the opening question around kind of defining kind of social value, I said, I challenge a lot of organisations to think about actually how they use their spending power and their influence to really shape and kind of challenge the nature of markets. And that has to be around how you also kind of stimulate kind of markets that need to kind of develop in your area. And I think going back to a point that Hilary said earlier, whilst we do need to focus absolutely on social value that we kind of get out of our specific contract, we also need to think about what social value means for local businesses, for the voluntary community sector, who have an inherent kind of hardwired social value in them, but actually don't always have the capacity or capability to do well in our processes. And unfortunately, we have big providers who are very skilled at writing bids. So actually part of a social value strategy, I think, needs to be, how do you better support the local market to develop and prosper? And that is by supporting their capability, but also being willing to look at your own processes and really challenge why you are doing stuff, make sure that we are being as accessible and inclusive as possible. And I've worked at various councils where we've had people come in and kind of critique the procurement processes. That's sometimes a painful process, but actually it's really kind of eye-opening around the kind of unintended barriers that councils often build in. And I think that has to be an important part also of developing a kind of social value strategy. And therefore, I think, it has a really big potential to support kind of the local economic agenda if we really committed to doing that right.
Thanks, Genine. That's great. Great answer.
I absolutely agree. And I think it goes back to, again, the point touched on earlier about when do you start thinking about social value in this process? I mean, actually, if you're doing this well, you're thinking not just about your procurement and your commissioning process, but again, as Janina said, about your local engagement strategy. How are you looking at all of your procurement activity across the board in a way that is going to not put structural barriers in the way of engaging and enabling your local suppliers to be able to bid for and win work with you, because there are, likely to be barriers, and we do need to be mindful that we're not creating processes and structures that put up more barriers, and we do need to look at how we remove the ones that exist.
Okay, great. But Michael, let's see if we've just got a minute or two if we've got another question on this section that we can take.
Yeah, okay. We've got one from Anna, and I think this is from the supplier side. So it says, at times during a formal tendering exercise, it can be hard to understand what is specifically needed from us. So she's interested to hear what authorities or purchasers are doing to communicate the types of service and the value objectives that they need.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've got to remember this is a two-way street, this whole exercise. And, we look at it because, we're about to spend the money, but, we should be helping potential suppliers to really understand what it is we're asking. And that's a great question, and looking at it from that perspective. Anybody want to come in on that question from Anna? No, because the responsibility is on us in local government to get it right. How often do we talk in hieroglyphs and all these acronyms and, the words we use, and only officers and politicians can understand them? When an SME wants to get in the mix, we've got to put it in language that is clear for them. What is it we're looking to procure? What are the benefits we're trying to seek to our organisation and the customers of that procured service, but around the social value, how we articulate it in real simple terms.
Yeah. Sorry, I was a bit slow trying to get my unmute button there. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really kind of good question. And I think, engagement, kind of echoing Hilary's kind of answer, is the key thing to me. I think historically, councils have been slightly too kind of uncertain or nervous about kind of pre-market engagement and talking to potential suppliers. But actually, I think that's a really important part of the process. Not just to better help them understand or better articulate what we want, but also going back to kind of earlier conversations to better understand the potential from the market as well. So I can't really kind of emphasize enough how important I think that pre-market engagement and continued engagement through the process actually is.
Hilary, just a quick question for you, going back to your social value panel. Does it include SMEs or an SME rep at all on the panel?
So we've got representatives from our enterprise centre, which does have quite a lot of engagement with small enterprises and does a lot to try and stimulate the market. So yes, we have tried to include representatives from businesses. Okay,
great. Look, okay, let's move on to the sort of third section in this session, and this is an important one. I'm conscious of this. We're all conscious of this in local government, that under tight budgets, very restricted on our funding. If we look at value, I think we're still largely driven, but I'll take it, whether it's a 60-40 balance or whatever it is looking at the pound notes that are involved in the deal. And we have to be really realistic about extracting value. So what does it mean in the modern age when we're thinking that way as local government? The whole price versus quality conflict on this, and the quality of it, not just the quality of the service that's provided, but the quality of the social value parts that are embedded in the procurement as well. How do we tackle that, knowing how much financial pressure local government is under at the moment? Anyone want to come in on that point? Rosie, are you happy?
I think it goes back to some of that tension that we were talking about right at the start of our conversation, doesn't it? And I don't think we can continue to look at that sort of price quality and racing for the lowest price possible, especially when we're talking, as we've talked today, in terms of some of those more fragile markets. So, for instance, I'm going to lean towards social care because that's my background, but the fragility of the market, especially now post-COVID, and heavens forbid we don't see anything as we have done in the past in the next couple of months, which will again put further pressure on that market. But if we're looking for that sort of price quality tendency to lean towards the price more in that tendering process, I mean, ultimately, it's what we discussed earlier on today. That does drive a false economy, because at the end of the day, all we're going to be doing is putting that market under increasing pressure to deliver more, to do more, to add more by way of value. Whereas if we worked a little bit differently and took more of a long-term view in terms of the sustainability of that market, and drove a greater balance between quality and price in the tendering process, I think personally we'd see far better outcomes in a more long-term fashion than we would necessarily if we were focused more on price at the point of tendering. What do colleagues on the call think?
Well, look, let me go to Genine and Hilary. I mean, what you were just talking about there for me was, rather than looking at the upfront costs, which I know we do, and that's often the headline. I think it's always the headline in this, but actually looking at the whole life cost of the service around some of those sensitive areas that you were talking about there, Rosie. Genine, or Hilary, whoever's comfortable to come in on this. I'm now feeling guilty every time I ask you, Genine, because you only keep saying 4 weeks in the City of London. So, but what do you as local authorities do in terms of looking at the whole life cost element and looking at actually trying to do something on the cheap? Often can have longer term consequences in the contract.
So while Rosie was speaking, there was kind of two things that kind of popped into my head, that actually too often we confuse good value with being the same as being cheap. and they're very distinct, very different things. And secondly, I feel in some places, actually the kind of evaluation criteria, so the price versus quality split, has become somewhat of a red herring. I've been in kind of meetings where we've spent countless time arguing whether we should have 60-40 or 65-35. And the reality is that 5% is not going to make a huge difference. And actually, we don't invest as much time really thinking about what are the questions we need to pose that will really tease out, make clear what's important to us, but really tease out what the value is. So that kind of balance between the quality and the price. And I think sometimes we get too kind of hung up on the evaluation criteria and not enough around making sure we are asking for the right things and the most important things. But absolutely, I think, thinking about what value it is, it has to be thinking about whole life costs. It has to be thinking about actually more and more as we move into kind of integrated system, it has to be thinking beyond just kind of displacing the problem by throwing it over the kind of fence to health or to somebody else. It has to be really starting to get more cognizant of actually what is the whole life cost, but also what is the cost to the system, and how can we really make sure that we're aware of that as we go through our processes.
Absolutely. Hilary, did you want to add anything to that?
I would absolutely echo all of that. I cannot tell you the number of times I sit in procurement board having questions with people about why their price quality ratio is as they are. And actually, if there has been thought of it, I do often find people's understanding of what we're trying to achieve by that possibly needs a little bit of an improvement, because there's also something about actually having a quality evaluation, unless you've actually structured your process in an effective way, actually it means virtually nothing at the end of the day. And the number of times I have people say, but I really need a higher quality ratio because that's probably the only way I'm going to get kind of like the outcomes I want. And it's a bit like, stop. Actually, go back to the start. Are you really clear about what you want? Have you put a proper spec together? Have you been really clear to the market about what it is that you're trying to get them to deliver to you? What are your aspirations? What are your long-term things? Where are you looking for innovation in what you're doing? And actually, I think there's, this is about taking a thoughtful look at how you balance those different things and quite recognizing that those budget pressures are not going to go away. They're not going to go away, but we need a better understanding and I think a more thoughtful process to design our commissioning and procurement activities in a way that drives the type of innovation that will deliver good value at the end of a process.
Great, Hilary. Thank you. Jonathan, let me come back to you. I know you've been sort of put in the sort of service provider, the supplier side of the argument. Let me put this back to you then. And it's a challenge for all of us, isn't it? Both the buyer and the seller, if I can put it in those terms. Is how confident should the seller be about knowing that times are tough in local government in terms of the money available to procure services and goods? How confident should they be at coming in at a higher price to justify the value that's in the full term of the contract, whether that's service value, quality of service, social value? How would you sort of talk that through with us?
It's complicated. So there's a logical argument to be made, but in certain areas in particular, more investment in the right things will save money further down the line. So let's take social care as an example. The temptation is probably to protect the statutory part of social care and cut what appear to be the nice to have services because you haven't got an alternative. Now we know the impact that will have on an absence of prevention and early intervention is to create long-term demand problems that will just then end up back in higher cost services, which the local authority will either end up paying for or attempt to squeeze it out of a very fragile market, not because it wants to, but because there's no choice. So that's the logic of the argument. But so often there's so little evidence to support these things. And so that comes back to the importance of the strategy and doing the proper research and planning on that to build that case. So it was interesting hearing about the price quality split from colleagues. So we're supporting one client who has a commercial approach, which is that it's 80% price, 20% quality on everything. That's not the approach I would take. I probably wouldn't be that prescriptive, but it is a viable commercial strategy if, and this is a big if you really, really understand what it is you're going out to the market for. Your requirement is absolutely crystal clear, and you've got confidence that the market will both understand that requirement and has the capacity and capability to deliver it. If you've got all of that locked down so that you're certain you're going to get what you're expecting to the standard that you want, then you can go in very hard on price. But I don't know any organizations who would say they're 100% confident that they're doing all of the research, all of the strategy, and all of the planning that they would like to every single time. I guess in our world, so we're qualifying out of tenders left, right, and centre at the moment because there's a huge volume on the market. So again, intelligence about what's happening from the supplier's point of view is really helpful for buyers. I think sometimes when you're dealing with the internal pressures and politics and workload, you can forget that there's an outside world and a competitive market, and you're not the only buyer in town. So we saw something this week where it was 40% price, no disclosed budget, and 15 questions to respond to. Now, if we were desperate, we might have gone for that opportunity, but we're not because there's loads of stuff on the market. So maybe that was the opportunity of a lifetime. Maybe that undisclosed budget was 50 million quid and we've missed out on that. But I doubt it. There was no way to make a sensible appraisal about whether or not that was a worthwhile opportunity and worth writing 15 responses to, given the volume of stuff on the market. So just having that sensitivity to what's happening within each of your category markets and how likely you are to get a response to that will be helpful for people.
Okay, great. Look, I'm just looking at the clock, so I want to just change gear a little bit on the conversation. We've talked a lot about the assessment during the procurement phase, but let's go in and talk about contract management because we're talking a lot about social value, which is key, and I think that's a big draw to this conversation. But also, there's actually the quality of the service and the quality of the goods that we're procuring. So let's talk about contract management, but also social value management, because we've got all these great promises, if you like, that have been made. We've pushed the button. We've gone with a particular service provider, and then we want to make sure that all those promises become reality and they actually deliver what they said they would. If you're talking about you're going to recruit 10 apprentices over a period, how are we checking that? So twofold there. Say contract management. Maybe interested to hear from the local authorities what you're doing. Any hints and tips or anything you've done to enhance contract management, and also the social value delivery. Is it happening? Are they matching the promises that we talked about at the beginning of the process? Hilary, can I come to you on that one?
Yes. So I absolutely acknowledge it is a really vital part of the process, and actually part of what I think we've all described in this session is looking at a procurement activity as part of a wider series of functions that need to be delivered, whether they're from one and the same people or a variety of different people. Contract management is is the next stage of that process, and I think it's absolutely really, really vital. Otherwise, you end up in exactly the same position 3 or 5 years down the line, where you are asking the same questions about the market that Jonathan's just described. So what we've done in Barking and Dagenham is that we've invested in developing a contract management toolkit. We're rolling out contract management training to DMTs and services that do a lot of contract management. And I know there are really strong pockets of the organisation where contract management is really robust, and particularly, I think I would look at our colleagues in care and children's support who clearly have very, very strong frameworks for doing that. Whether or not that is consistent across the board is a question that I think we need to challenge ourselves to answer. So we will be rolling out contract management training across the organisation. I'll have sort of a central advice and guidance team for contract management activity. But one of the things I think that we are going to do to try and push a different culture, which is looking at the whole life of a particular activity, is as part of our sort of commissioning and procurement process, we'll be including a requirement for services to undertake an assessment of the risks associated with the operational delivery of any contract. So that will hopefully force people to actually start thinking about, okay, now I've got somebody else delivering this. Where are the pinch points? What are the things I need to do? Am I making sure that we're checking their business continuity plan annually? Am I confident that the risks that I have in the supply chain are being managed and mitigated appropriately. So by including the requirement to assess the risks before we go out to tender, I'm hopeful that will actually help to change the dial on the conversation about contract management and make sure that we're putting in an appropriate framework for the contracts that are being managed. So that will be something that hopefully will be implementing in the new financial year. And then broadly, I've mentioned my social value coordinator. I think it's really important that there is a central focus on actually monitoring outcomes, particularly in social value, because I do think it's as we've said, it's the type of activity where budgets are tight. It's the sort of thing that people will leave at the end of a contract management process and think, it's not that important as, anything else. So one of the aspects that that our coordinator is doing is actually working with commissioners to stay on top of making sure that those outcomes actually get delivered and that we can report them at the end of the year. And I do think that it's changing the culture. It is absolutely moving the dial from where we were sort of 18, 24 months ago to where we are now.
Absolutely. I think, there's two things there. I think it's a challenge to all local authorities and the people on this call is once you procure, it's asking that question honestly of ourselves, how good are we at monitoring the operational delivery? And I know the bulk of your response there, Hilary, focused on operational delivery, but then the tangential question to that is how good are we at monitoring the actual promises of social value delivery as well? Genine or Rosie, have you got any comments on that part as well? Anything you've done differently in local government that really tries to draw that into the review part of the contract management?
So I think that's a really important question that you posed, and it's one that I often get, particularly from elected members, which is around the impact question. So so you did all that stuff. Your report says this is the output or the throughput of kind of social value commitments. There's always a so what question. What does that mean for real people in a place and whether it's improved their lives? And I think if we're completely honest, that is the bit that we haven't quite got right yet. So there are, some things that go some way to helping us do that, whether that's kind of the national TOMs or other things. But I think it's a way that still a bit that actually councils need to do a lot more work on and actually looking across their contract portfolios. So actually, what is the quantum of all those commitments and what difference does it make to actual real people in a real place? And I don't think we have the answers to that quite yet.
Yeah, it's good that you mention elected members there as well as being one, because often elected members can have input into your procurement process and know how we're going to score different things. But if you just do that and leave the officer to get on with it and let the contract run, you've just ticked a load of boxes. And you do it on the basis of the fact that you think, well, that's going to happen. So actually, it's about, we often do it in some of our committee settings where you'll bring back some of your big service providers, maybe around housing, and you look at the KPIs in terms of what they're delivering. But actually, these social value KPIs, Rosie, where they've made promises at the outset, it's not just looking at the operational performance, is it tracking to budget and all that stuff, but actually, what about these great things you told us that you would do that would impact our community or impact some of these big policy things around climate change or whatever it would be? I don't know if you've got a comment on that briefly, anybody.
Can I come in? I'm going to be slightly contentious now because we've only got 8 minutes left. But I know you've picked up on the question of social value TOMs, and I'm strongly resisting at this stage. I think I will end up having to go with the flow, but strongly resisting an effort to monetize the outcomes that we get through social value. And I know they're kind of like, there are people on the call from social value organizations and there's a lot of work that's been going into them. But I actually think, Janine's response is actually the right one. What I think that we certainly are trying to do here is to focus on the real difference that this makes to individuals in their lives and therefore the wider community benefits. And actually, I think there's a point that once we start to monetize the impact, as in we've got £2 million worth of social value impact, we've got 3 million, 4 million, 500,000. Actually, I think we lose the power of that conversation. It becomes about money rather than about really making a difference. And actually, the bit that social value does is it's the bit that really makes the difference. It's the bit that we don't have to necessarily do, but that can really drive real changes in real people's lives. And for as long as I can do, I will produce annual reports that look at social value, that talk about actual outcomes for people, for community groups, for, you know, businesses and the local community more generally, rather than going, you've got £1 million worth of social value this year, like, well done you. I think that really loses the power of what we're trying to do here, and I want to resist that as long as possible.
I think you've nailed it there, Hilary, and I think that's the challenge, because you can't measure sometimes personal impact on people's lives. It's hard to measure, you know, sometimes these future outcomes. If I've created skills for a person that's able to get them a job and has kept them out of a life of crime and therefore out of the system, you know, there's all of these things that we just can't possibly measure. So you do it with an element of hope. We have to try and think carefully to try and bring a bit of science into it somewhere down the line. It's all about qualitative and quantitative measures. You can measure pounds and pence much more readily than you can measure personal impact on people's lives, and maybe how that changed their direction and took them into a particular career path, whatever it was.
But I just see in the future, this is the law of unintended consequences. The minute we start to monetize something, you know, in 5 years, 10 years down the line, actually we only see social value as a pound sign. And I just think that's, you know, we need to be really wary of sort of going down that route, because that's not what it's here for.
Yeah, I agree completely, Hilary. So this is one of the points I was trying to make earlier, where I said I think there are a lot of good intentions, but practice needs refinement. So I don't think any of us on this panel think that social value ought to be a wish list of free stuff. Yeah. And if you put a price tag on it, it starts to look a bit more like your Amazon wish list than it does the actual spirit of improving outcomes for local people. What I do think is good is coming up with a consistent way to try and weigh up, say, the value of, you know, carbon reduction commitments versus creating local employment opportunities. Not an easy thing to do, and I don't think the model's perfect, but if you are going to put a high evaluation weighting into tenders for social value, you need some sort of fair and consistent way to measure that for bidders. So, you know, it's good that the spirit of that's been taken forward. But this is incredibly complex stuff when we're talking about social return on investment. So we've just finished an evaluation of Oldham Council's Thriving Communities programme. That wasn't one spreadsheet with some proxy financial figures in. That was a 9-month investigation full of user feedback, case studies, stories about how this had affected the lives and businesses and communities of people involved. So this is complicated stuff. And I agree with you that reducing it down to pound, shilling and pence is not necessarily going to meet the spirit of what we want to achieve.
Okay, great. Well, I'm just conscious of time. I want to sort of throw a nice sort of question to all of you on the panel. And we've got a few minutes. I want to take. So I've seen some questions popping up on the screen as well. So I'm sure. I think that really became quite meaty there, that discussion. I think I really like where that was going. And just on that, if we look at the whole thing and starting to admit that it is complex, but it's absolutely vital and it's necessary, and it's not something we can shy away from. It's something we all have to grapple as procurers. If there was one thing that you could change in this whole agenda over the next 12 months, what would it be? And I don't know who wants to have a go at.
I know what mine would be. I think to continue to move the dial on the difference between quantitative and qualitative social value. So rather than conversations about are you including social value in your commissioning and procurement thinking, more to are you actually maximising the opportunities to deliver social value through the process that you are undertaking, and that's taking into account the local market engagement, stimulating local suppliers, as well as then getting the nice to have the added benefits of the wider collective return. So moving from quantitative to qualitative conversations, I think, would be where I'd like to see that.
Thanks, Hilary. Rosie, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, mine kind of links, my wish list kind of links to Hilary's quite nicely. And to support some of what you'd like to see as your future vision, Hilary, what I'd like to see then is that sort of greater integration between commissioners, procurement, communities, providers. Some places it happens and it happens really well, and there's really good understanding of community voice of what those social value outcomes needs to be. And therefore, again, like we said earlier, they're translatable into specifications. super clear in terms of KPIs. Providers aren't, and suppliers aren't, promising great big things that we haven't necessarily asked for and we've got no way of measuring. It's having that real clear understanding of what it is we need to achieve at a local level, a real collaborative vision for how it is we're going to do that collectively together moving forwards, and some real ways in which that we can understand from a qualitative and quantitative perspective what it is that we're achieving, and then opportunity to redefine and refine those as we move through the whole of that procurement process. So my wish list is greater integration.
Good. Genine, what you've got one wish in this very particular field, what would it be?
So my one, I think, is just fairly simple, is that to remove the notion that any of this is optional. I mean, if we talk about social value, ethical procurement, all of those things, and given the challenges we face as a society, as an economy, they're not going to be solved by just buying things more cheaply.
Correct. Great point. Because there's a whole story off the back of that as well, as we know. Jonathan, in a word or two, anything from you, and I'll see if we can turn in the minute or so we've got left to a couple of comments from or questions from the audience.
Yeah, so with apologies to any colleagues from the Cabinet Office on today's call, my one wish would be that I would rip up that wretched PPN that requires authorities to evaluate social values, and I'd replace it with one that requires people to include social value in their procurement strategy.
Okay, great. Michael, we're pretty much on time, but is there a question there that's really appealed to you in terms of what's come through over the last few minutes?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of good questions. Perhaps what we could do is play these afterwards and send out some responses. One that was quite interesting is, would it be helpful to create a standard social value assessment and methodology for all local authorities to use? What were people's thoughts on that generally? I know that sort of links to the TOMs, which we've touched on, and that was in a number of other questions, was what were people's views on the TOMs? So perhaps we can link those two.
I think there's, I'll try and just chip in on that one, if I can, for brevity. I think it sort of conflicts with what we talked about earlier, where we look at particular needs, from in rural communities to city communities, etc. So if you start, one size does not fit all in this. But on the other hand, there might be scope for some guidance, some standard, not template, but standard guidance that, tries to fulfill some of the wishes and the obligations that, we talked about a moment ago, the way we want councils are procuring goods and services to think in that. So I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I think there's some standard guidance kind of off the back of this that can make people think differently. Michael, one more question and then we'll go to a wrap up.
Sure, yeah. So in relation to those social value objectives not being delivered, is anyone looking at standard clauses to be added to the contract to address non-delivery?
Anybody want to pick up on that at all?
I think it goes back to the question about contract management. I mean, it's an integral part of the contract management process, and actually the bit that's often understated in any contracting bit is the relationship that you have with your suppliers that needs to be built. And I think that's key to getting good outcomes no matter what you're doing.
Yeah, if you add to that Janine's wish that this is not optional and not an add-on, then social value becomes just like any other contractual KPI. You manage it in exactly the same way.
Okay. Great. Look, I was going to go around and ask for some final comments, but I thought the wish list piece just then was pretty good in terms of summarising what we'd need to see. So I'm conscious that it's just gone past the hour. So I think what I'd like to do just in closing really is thank you all as a panel. Thanks to Peopletoo and Human Engine for laying this on. I think we could have talked on easily for another hour, I'm sure. And I know there were so many questions that were coming in. So my particular thanks to people who've dialed in this morning and put questions. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of them, but I've tried to really move this on at a pace and interject questions if we've gone through. But I think, David's just said it was a great conversation. So it's a great conversation because we've all come together to do it. Panelists, audience, people have put questions, people have answered questions. So big thanks from me, and I hope you all have a great afternoon, and we're rapidly approaching Christmas. Keep well, keep safe, and hope we can enjoy that as well. So my thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks all. Take care.